Donc, bienvenue à ce séminaire mensuel IDEE. Aujourd'hui, le séminaire est organisé en fin d'après-midi parce que nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir Andreas de Barros, Andy de Barros, qui est professeur à l'Université de Californie, Irvine. Et donc, merci beaucoup, Andy. Andy s'exprimer en anglais. Et donc, il va nous présenter une expérimentation en Inde qui va nous apprendre des choses sur les technologies, qui est un sujet qui nous intéresse beaucoup à IDEE. Donc, Andy, thank you very much for being with us, and I give you the floor for this presentation.
Thanks so much, Mark. And it's just great to be with you here today. A little bit of background is I started working with JPL as a research associate 13 years ago. This is the first time though that I present to folks at JPL Europe. So it's great to meet you all. I know there's others also coming from schools of education. Personally, my background is in education. So I really enjoy this collaboration, both with JPL, but also with ed schools and education practitioners. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and your questions. You can interrupt me throughout. If there's longer discussions, maybe we punt it to the end of the presentation. But yes, ask questions throughout, maybe raise your hand, and I hope I catch you. As Mark mentioned, this is evidence on the cluster randomized trial and how to support students in India through technology. I'm trying to present basically 3 studies in one. I'm going to present the effects of a cluster randomized trial on technology pre-pandemic, a technology intervention post-pandemic that try to help students catch up after learning losses during the pandemic. But since this is data from a over 6-year partnership, I'm going to show you panel evidence in the same schools also on comparable test score data collected pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, and what I believe is some of the first panel evidence that actually goes across all of these 3 periods and provides comparable estimates as to like how much students learned during each of these periods, which I'm very excited about. And first time I'm presenting this, so I'm really excited to hear your feedback on this. But maybe just starting with the last slide that often goes last, but I think should go first, and that's why I put it first. That's a big thank you. This is a study that is done in collaboration with Avanti Fellows. It's an NGO in India that's really, I think it's for me at the forefront of NGOs that embraces evidence and the kind of randomized evaluations that we do. Again, this is an over 6-year partnership that I've been in with Avanti Fellows. So kudos to them to embracing evidence so much. Their partnership with the government of Haryana. So all of this data that I'm presenting is data collected in government schools in Haryana. So thank you to the school administrators, teachers, students, my university, and co-researchers that gave me feedback on this. But I also want to highlight Rahul Kumar, who now is in the position that I started at JPL, and really support the entire project so much. So thanks to that, and also of course thanks to the funders who generously supported the study. Right. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction, and using this word that I learned living in the United States, which Americans call a pre-cap. So we know we're from the pandemic. Maybe you're busy and you're on your computers, right? So I want to start out by giving you some of the most important points, and hope that excites you, and make sure you get those points before you dive into your emails. Don't, but in case you plan to, here are the most important points. And then I hope I get you to stay and just stay with us here. So starting with this intro, obviously there's nothing new here that the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted schooling, led to massive learning losses globally. This is a quote from a publication that I have with a long list of co-authors, Noam Angus being one of them, Ben Piper being another, colleagues of JPL being another. We basically modeled learning losses over time, and we predicted that the pandemic might lead to something like 2.8 years of lost learning by grade 10. So just like this trajectory, as like if students now stay further behind even during the pandemic because of the pandemic, that might have these long-lasting deficits. And now we have fairly good evidence that actually these learning losses even during the pandemic happened, right? So there's nothing new here. the big question then is what this did in the long term, like as we model here, and then also like whether there's any recovery happening post-pandemic. Right? There's a new paper out that is just forthcoming in the JHR by 3 of the JPL affiliates, Abhijit Singh, Madhusudhan Romero, and Kartik Muralidharan, from India, actually. And pulling a quote from that, basically they found that after schools reopened, there was a rapid catch-up in learning among primary school kids, and 2/3 of the learning losses that were documented by December 2021 was made up for by May 2022. Right? So in about 5 or 6 months of schools reopening, almost 2/3 of the learning losses that had happened are gone, right? Which is amazing, right? Like that's like a very rosy story. That would tell you, hey, we don't need to worry so much. Well, the pandemic happened, learning losses happened, but it seems like kids are catching up. Right? I'm gonna show you what I think are some evidence that like speaks against that, and I think that's important to just maybe have that data point. But I think what is contradicting this a little bit. The third point that I wanted to throw into this introduction is just the embrace of educational technology that has happened since the pandemic, right? So as we all know, response to the COVID-19 pandemic led to this, educational technology is being used for learning out of school, but now there's even also an interest in, now that teachers have become more familiar with educational technologies, maybe we should continue to use that, like after school or even in the classroom, right? So there's a great interest in doing that. There's an interest in using educational technology potentially as a means to help students catch up. I'm going to show you evidence around that in terms of 2 interventions. One, as to what happens when we encourage teachers to use educational technology in the classroom, one. And second, what happens when students are receiving additional instruction through technology after school through remote instruction. This is actually what I do and what I find. So just to give you this recap one more time, I have primary panel data on math learning gains among 3 cohorts of students attending the same set of Indian secondary government schools. All of this is primary data, so I constructed a test and hand collected this together with the teams at JPL. So we have a pre-COVID cohort, 2018 to 2019, a COVID cohort, 2019 and to 2021, and a post-COVID cohort of 2021 to 2023. So we just wrapped up this data collection. So it's in the same schools, and we can now construct these student level panel data covering all of these 3 periods in a common set of schools. We have these 3 cohorts, and then we can compare and what the learning was like before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after. What I can do with that is construct what I call a relative learning gain or relative learning loss. Right? So I know how much kids learned pre-pandemic, and I can express how much they learn now, and can compare this. If this is more, that would be a relative learning gain, and certainly if this is less, then I have a relative loss. So this is quite nice because I can compare the productivity of students learning over time at the student level and can make this direct comparison in the same schools. I know where they started, and I can make that relative comparison. Plus, this data is fairly representative of India's government schools. This is not because I randomly sampled all of the students in India, but it happens to be so. And I can show you evidence that actually these government schools, on just observable characteristics, look very similar to India's government schools overall, which is quite nice. What do I find? I find a sustained disruption of student learning in the 2-year period after schools reopened, right? So this contradicts what we just heard about, that there's a big recovery happening and students are catching up and all of this is going away. If anything, learning has come to a standstill after the pandemic, even though schools reopened. There's actually absolutely no learning gains happening over this 2-year periods. If anything, the 10th graders that I have in my sample are slightly lower than where they started in grade 8. When you compare that to how much students learned before the pandemic, there's a relative learning loss of about 0.4 standard deviations in math for students starting in grade 8, compared to how much they learned before. And even more worrying is that there's actually no difference in the 1-year period after the pandemic, immediately after the pandemic, versus the last year that we just finished. So it's not like they stopped learning and now they're catching on and things are getting better. No, they're basically still a complete standstill in that, even in the 2nd year. Right. So terrible news for you all on this evening at 5 p.m. your time. Now you're going to ask yourself, well, okay, how can we solve this? And what role might educational technology play in this? So one idea is to, ask teachers to blend their instruction with technology. So this is exactly what I actually did prior to the pandemic, and I'm going to share that, and I have a paper out on this. So I'm going to wrap up the study, however, for you. So this is small videos that are given to teachers and encouraging teachers to use these videos in their instruction. They're not asked to do anything different, just helping them teach what they're expected to teach and blend their instruction with these high quality video materials, right? These small snippets, right? And it's the largest cluster randomized trial studying such an ethic intervention as a complement to teaching, so not replacing teaching, but really just giving teachers something to teach along with. And it largely shuts down other channels in terms of, let's say, how does that conflate any impacts with, let's say, training that teachers are getting or additional materials that teachers are getting. So I am able to tease out the effect of just the technology comparison, the technology component. I have super rich data, not just on test scores, but also over 1,500 classroom observations, student interviews, and so forth. So I can also tell you something very precisely of the mechanisms of what's going on in the classroom, what's going on with students. Again, this is across 240 schools. At baseline, this intervention served over 25,000 students, so this is quite large. And for me, interesting just pre-pandemic, what the effect is of asking teachers to do that. Now, maybe pause for 1 second, think about what did that do? Does it help teachers? Does it do nothing? Maybe does it hurt teachers? What's your best guess? Gonna give it away. I found negative effects of this EdTech intervention on math, no effects on science learning, and no effects of the non-tech intervention. So just giving the same bundle of things without the videos, but let's say giving teachers also visits and training. At least after 11 months, this really disrupted teaching. I find intent to treat effects of negative 15% of a standard deviation in math. Of that intervention, the bundle of interventions that includes that blended instruction piece. This is not about implementation failure. Everybody loved this stuff. Teachers used it. However, I find negative effects on instruction and the instructional quality that students receive, and even student attitudes are negatively affected by that intervention. Right? So all of that is basically consistent with adjustment costs, what economists would call adjustment costs. So you bring in a new technology, and at first, at least in the short run or after 11 months, this educational technology is really disruptive. Sometimes we hear about disrupting education, but this was very disruptive in that sense, and at least nothing happened in science and in math that had negative effects even on test scores. So I told you this is an NGO that embraces evidence, and what I think is the best reaction to something like this is to pause and think, okay, so now what? Like, you can either try to fight the results and try to make them go away, and this is the opposite of that, right? So Avanti Fellows, the NGO, really embraced these findings, and the pandemic came around, schools shut, they reoriented themselves with their intervention and said, okay, let's do something different. If this is hurting math instruction, let's pull it from the classrooms and turn this intervention into an after-school program, right? So we take our videos, we actually have teachers who can teach remotely. So we're going to layer this on top and say, okay, let the teachers teach. We're going to provide some of those materials 5 or 6 times a week, actually, as an after-school program and offer that to students, right? That's the other second technology intervention that I'm giving you evidence on. This happened then post-pandemic, and so this exploits the random assignment of schools to either offering or not offering that to students, right? So now we have this at-scale cluster randomized trial of EdTech, not as a complement of teaching, but as an additional input. And I can also compare that to schools that got some intervention, but that just consisted of giving the schools workbooks and some additional support, but not this after-school technology. So I can even, again, tease out the difference between what is just the part of just giving the technology versus giving some additional supports that doesn't include the technology. And again, I'm somebody who's really focused on breaking up these black boxes in education, not just looking at test scores. So again, I have detailed classroom observations, and I have teacher interviews and student interviews as well, and can show you some of the data on that as well. Now, again, what's your best guess? What happened? Like, where is this going? Maybe pause, think. what's your best guess about what the effects are?
Works.
Works. Okay, Mark is I wish, right? So I can give you the results. Positive effects of this, yes, Mark. So on student attitudes and perceptions on math. So when I ask students about, how do you feel about math? Does math make you nervous? Stuff like that. There is some positive effects around that. But even after 2 years, there's no effect on math test scores after 2 years, right? This is, again, not about implementation failure. So I'm going to show you data on like how much students actually attended these sessions. They did. And there's also no notable heterogeneity in impact. So it's not like this works for boys, so it doesn't work for girls, or the other way around. There was some miscommunication that is my mistake in terms of when the abstract went out to you guys, but that is actually no notable heterogeneity in impacts. It doesn't help girls more than boys. It's not like it works for just the kids who are super motivated and come in with higher levels. So Mark, no, unfortunately, no. It has some positive effects on student attitudes, but not on test scores. All right, so this is what I call the pre-cap. I promise this would be quick, but I want to give you more detail and just context and just maybe let's start with this whole experimental setup. Again, this is a study that is overall over 6 years of a collaboration with this public-private partnership, and I haven't worked in this environment now for a long time. So this map is showing you Haryana in blue and in red, and then there's 8 districts highlighted in red here, where the schools are located. We conducted this 3-arm cluster randomized trial, assigning schools at random to either a business as usual control group or either one of 2 types of treatment groups. So one receives a full bundle of interventions that, as I just mentioned, either has in the pre-pandemic period the tech intervention promoting blended instruction in the classroom, versus after pandemic in math, it is being shifted to a intervention that is this after school teaching, right? There's a third group, however, that is like a partial control that is basically the same intervention, but without the technology. So you're going to see that the intervention has something like, let's say, workbooks that are print materials. And this might be, this could be of interest, just like, hey, maybe this all doesn't rely on technology. Maybe we can have the same impact without technology, just providing something like workbooks. To answer that question, I also have this partial control that basically strips away the technology and just gives a part of that intervention to schools. Right? As I mentioned, this data is fairly representative of the universe of India's government schools. So I have very rich data. I can actually use GIS and location data on these schools and can drop this and link the data to census information. So I have the village characteristics or town characteristics. I also have the universe of data on government schools in India. So I know of all the schools in India, what their score characteristics look like. I can link this to what's called the National Achievement Survey. And I also have information from the Haryana government on their leaving certificates, so what they call the board exams in grade 10. Overall, these schools are slightly positively selected within the state, so they look a little bit better compared to other schools in Haryana. But overall, they look fairly representative of India, so which might be maybe for you more interesting that they're actually fairly representative. Now, this random assignment also led to very similar groups. So randomization worked. I told you there's multiple cohorts now. I'm showing you here for the very first cohort, there was like 1 or 2 variables that were imbalanced, nothing crazy in terms of imbalance here. And certainly for the after school instruction part, even there, the baseline was completely balanced on everything that you can think about, right? So again, here, just a map of India. Every red dot here is a government school, and I have data on that. So I made that map by just using all the GIS locations, then dropping these GIS locations, for example, into a census map, and then matching that to census tracts, and then, for example, pulling out information on the village where a school is located. What that allows us to do is not just compare the school characteristics to other schools and villages in India, but I also can use that later as controls to get a bit more precision on my estimates. Right? So very rich data here. And in terms of balance, yes, this things fairly checks out, and it's the beauty of the randomized trial that once you assign at random, you generate these groups that are just comparable on average. Right? Main outcome, as I mentioned, are written assessments, group administered, paper-based, have about 60 multiple choice questions. I designed these, and I link those with a two-parameter item response theory IRT model. So that's important. That's basically the go-to method that's used in all large assessments that you might know from Europe as well. Let's say PISA uses that. These are the common psychometrics methods that allow you to link test scores across rounds that exploit overlapping or reoccurring items or test questions over multiple rounds. So that means that even maybe Mark and I are in a different grade, if there's a few test questions on our tests that overlap, I can use that to link our two scores onto a common scale. I can do that across grades, but I can also do that over time. And since I constructed these tests, and I did this in the 3 cohorts and 3 periods pre and during and past pandemic, I can link everybody onto a common scale, which is really nice, right? So I don't think that exists to have these like overtime panels where we can really compare across these 3 time periods where students are at in terms of their learning. Right? There's additional outcomes that I can just pull. Like since I constructed these, I have what's called an item map or a test blueprint in terms of like what we're measuring. So I have subdomains in terms of, let's say, content domains in math. I can compare algebra versus geometry. In terms of cognitive domains, I can compare something like higher order thinking skill questions that are more like around problem solving versus more like rote learning kind of test questions or lower order thinking skill questions. These are more secondary. I'm going to be focusing more on the main outcomes, but if you want, you can dig into these results. Right? And then, as I mentioned before, I just have very rich data on implementation fidelity and program take-up. For both tech interventions, I have all the backend data, so I know exactly when and whether a teacher, for example, switched on their projector. This is not reliant on me looking over the teacher's shoulder and checking. I actually have every single time they use this. I also have attendance records on all the students at the student level with their ID as to whether they attended one of these after-school sessions, for example. And then I combine this with classroom observations, student interviews, and teacher interviews, just to measure something like, does the instructional quality change in these classrooms? How are these students feeling differently towards math, or in the first intervention towards science as well? So we have this very rich data over the 6-year period. Okay. Told you there's these 3 buckets of evidence. A, to what extent does learning differ now in the post-pandemic period versus what happened in the year prior? Let me show you that first, and then I'm going to show you again the 2 results of the 2 RCTs. The first one on blended instruction prior pandemic, and then the second one on remote learning post-pandemic. Right. So starting with this, here I'm showing you test scores for these 3 periods of time for kids who started for every cohort in grades 8 and 9. So the way you read this is like this red line here are 9th graders and their average math test scores, and where did they end up after 1 year? So the 9th graders learned about 18% of a standard deviation. So they moved from here in December 18th up here in November 19th. So this is about 1 year of learning before the pandemic. Right? Interestingly, the 8th graders actually started slightly higher than 9th graders. That's really interesting, right? Fascinating, but it's just what the data shows. And then they learned, and they ended up actually slightly above the 10th graders. But they also learned about 20% of a standard deviation. This is my yardstick.
Sorry, Andy, just to understand this 8 versus 9. So the item response model means that you have items in common, and therefore you can really consider that the 8 is above the 9.
Yes, I can compare all of these data points.
Thanks to the items in common to the 2. Is that right?
That's right. And for all of these data points, they're all on the same scale. So that's great. So I can not only compare 8th versus 9th grade here, I can also compare this 9th grader versus that 1 year later. As I track that individual student, I know exactly like how much did they learn over that time period.
Okay.
I can then compare that, and that's against what happened during the pandemic, and that's on the same scale. For this new cohort of 8th graders who started in November 19th. And I can compare this against this post-pandemic cohort that started in December 2021. Right? And note that there's like this 1 year period from 18th to 19th. That's my yardstick that I'm then going to use to compare what happens post-pandemic. And that's what I'm going to call a relative learning loss. Right? So I'm going to compare this 8 to 9 pre-pandemic, that's my pre-pandemic growth, versus this 8 to 9 post-pandemic. I can also do something like for the longer period, and there's going to be issues because there's a longer 2-year period, and I'm not focusing on this so much. You could do that too, but this is also a year, and this is also a year from 9 to 10. So this you can, I like it when you can eyeball a result, right? You can eyeball the result that like in the pre-pandemic period, they learned that much relative to how much they learned. Now in the post-pandemic period, over also a year, how much did they learn? They didn't. If anything, they lost a little bit of learning, right? So you can say, like, I'm going to estimate the relative learning loss by comparing this learning post-pandemic vis-a-vis how much they learned in pre-pandemic period. And that difference in how much they learned is what I call a relative learning loss, right? That's the reduction in productivity or the reduction in learning over time. That's exactly right.
Sorry, just to make sure I understand the graph correctly, just to understand, during the COVID period, there seems to be an increase in learning for the 9th grader from the students moving to 8 to 9, but not the opposite for the 9 to 10th.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is for me also like extremely like surprising, right? Like these 9th graders lost about 10% of the standard deviation. These 8th graders actually gained something. They gained less than they gained before. So you have a relative learning loss, but they learned something over that time period, right? They learned less or not as fast as before the pandemic, but they learned something, right?
But there is this huge loss, and not relative, just loss for the 9th grader, which seems surprising that it's so huge compared to the other graders.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly how you read that. And for me, it's just fascinating to see that. I would have never expected these 8th graders, and I have no idea why like the 9th dip during the pandemic and the 8th graders grow. Certainly less than they did before, but like for me, I have no explanation for that. What I'm going to be now focusing on is this part, but that's absolutely right. And you can also, I don't think we even have something like this there's a lot of better evidence now on just learning losses, and I think that contributes to that. I think that the newest part is this, right? Like nobody knows, like, again, what happens now. And if anything, we have this one study that tells us that there's, now everybody's recovering. This tells me that they're not recovering at all, right? So this is the newest piece here, which I think scares me a lot.
Andy?
Yeah.
Presumably you have standard errors around those estimates.
Yes, Mark, how would you model this, right? So I'm telling you, I'm going to show you the standard errors in just 1 second, but how do you do that? I'm going to tell you how I went about this, right? Basically, I went like this about this and how to calculate these standards. It took me a while to figure that out, but how to do that, right? What I did is I'm going to run a regression that is, you see the equation here, which is you have a post indicator, and the y here on the left hand side is basically like where you end up after 1 year. So I'm going to run this for these periods here. And I'm going to start running this and start estimating this by having this function here, where I'm expressing these 1 year later learning as a function of the 1 year prior learning, interacted with school fixed effects, a gender indicator, and a grade indicator. So I'm actually estimating this first in the first step without having this post and just focusing on the pre-pandemic cohort. So this is over here, just to get these coefficients of like, where would I think you'd end up after 1 year, right? Then I'm taking these coefficients and I'm constraining that regression and now I'm using the post-pandemic period. Now this post indicator here is now telling me like, how far are you away from where I think you should have ended up, knowing everything that I know about how much kids usually grew in the post-pandemic period and the pre-pandemic period, right? Now, when I estimate this is a two-step procedure, right? I first need to estimate these coefficients such that I can constrain those, and then I plug those into a constraint regression that has that post estimator. Now you're suddenly in some two-stage regression, and just like you would do this in, let's say, an IV, I actually run this as a bootstrap, right? So I have this long bootstrap that estimates first this, then constrains it, then estimates the post here. And then I do this 1,000 times, store it 1,000 times away, and then I'm going to get a mean, which the mean is this comparison. And then the standard deviation of all these bootstrap estimates are the standard errors. And here they are. So sorry to take one more slide, but here they are, these standard errors. Right? So in the first year, the students learned about 20% of the standard deviations less compared to how much they learned in the period. In the second year, again, they learn about 19% of the standard deviation less compared to how much they would have learned as expected. And then when you combine these two things, it's about 40% of or 39% of a standard deviation. The standard error is below here. Yeah, Mark, this is where you were going after, right?
So I'm not sure I understand perfectly. This reflects the curves that are in the yellow box, basically. Is that what it does?
No. This is comparing the ignoring the yellow altogether. This is for this post-pandemic period. How much as you move from 8 to 9, how much is this the fact that you're going down? How much is that below where I would have expected you to go?
Okay.
Given what I know from the pre-pandemic period, right? So I would have thought you'd go up here because I know that from the pre-pandemic period. So I compared that where you should have been up here versus where you ended up. That's that estimate. The first year, you're ending up about 20% of a standard deviation below. And then I do the same thing for these guys here that start in 9. And now you should have gone from 9 to 10 over that 1 year period. You should have gone up here, but you ended up down here. Right? And when you compare that, then that's going to be that about 20% of the standard deviation. Together over that, if you sum those, it's going to be about 40% of a standard deviation loss compared to, this is relative losses, relative to how much we would have expected you to learn in what we know from the pre-pandemic period. Right? You could just predict this out by the 1 year prior score. What I'm doing is I'm actually taking into account and interacting the prior score with school fixed effects, gender and grade. So not I'm allowing for actually you attending the school to be expected to learn as much as whatever the kids learned in your school prior, right? Which is just, it doesn't make a difference too much, but I thought I was more comfortable with like, hey, I really want to compare you against your classmates or your peers who are attending the same schools 1 year prior. This is overall. Now you might want to ask yourself, hey, how does this differ by gender? It doesn't differ by gender. So this is fairly similar across gender. So I'm doing this for girls, for boys, and then comparing this for girls versus boys. There's not a lot of difference in terms of these relative learning losses across boys versus girls. Girls seem to be, like over all this 2 year period, there's nothing. I also do this by baseline learning levels. So like, did you start out in the weakest quarter of kids versus in the stronger quarter of kids as you start out learning? Interestingly, it seems like the better performing kids as to like where kids started out were hurt a bit more, right? So especially in this first year post-pandemic, as schools reopened, you see that actually the weakest quartile didn't see a lot of losses or relative losses, but the strongest quartile saw more than a half a standard deviation losses. So there's a half a standard deviation difference in terms of how much they were hurt. Not so much in the second year, but then this is on altogether, there's this about 0.45 standard deviation difference in terms of these losses. So not statistically significant looking at the standard errors, but like, maybe you can tell some story that this is hurting the kids more that were in the strongest quartile to start with. But yeah, certainly, like I think the most important piece here is this, or visually this, right? That relative to how much they learned before, they now don't, and relative to that, much less. But even in absolute terms, for me, this is mind-blowing, right? Like that the 10th grader now, after 2 years, is actually slightly below where they started. So if anything, they lost learning in the post-pandemic period, right? Okay, I told you, 3 papers in 1 presentation. But yeah, Mark.
So in this exercise, when you compute the standard errors, you don't take into account that you have estimated the item response model to start with, or do you? Do you bootstrap also the item response model estimation?
No, you don't. So most people.
So part of the noise may come from what is in your coefficients of the item response model or something like this. That you
Yeah.
Maybe it's a bit more noisy than you claim, right?
Yeah, and you're wading into like a big debate between psychometricians and economists. The go-to approach to let's say you run an RCT and you get test scores. Economists will run an IRT model and then plug that in on your left-hand side as the outcome variable. A psychometrician would tell you that this estimate of learning also is estimated with noise, and you shouldn't do that. And you might have seen approaches to then use plausible values for this. If you work with TIMSS data or with PISA data, they tell you to do that. Most economists won't care, but carefully you should include not just this two-step procedure in the bootstrap, but you're absolutely right. You could also include the estimation of the test scores in that, right? But yeah, you're right. Cool. Okay. 2 RCTs in 20 minutes. So again, this one was the first one, pre-pandemic. I think this is important to still show it was pre-pandemic, but there's a lot of appetite for that. It's like, okay, teachers now have used technology more. Should we encourage teachers to keep using technology in the classroom? So this is what I did pre-pandemic. This was my job market paper. This was basically the intervention. Teachers were given video materials to teach along with these materials. Right? Nothing changed in terms of the curriculum. The school books didn't change, but they got these small snippets of videos that they were supposed to use in the classroom. So imagine you're teaching science. In today's science class, there's a class on the cell. So here's a video that you can use to get everybody interested in the cell. Teach along with that. Right? There were also workbooks that went along with that, and visits of the NGO to the schools, and just to tease out the relative importance of these two components, as I mentioned, I have these 2 different treatment groups. One group got everything, and then one group just got the visits and the workbook only. So potentially I can see the difference between, does this just work without the technology component, right? All of this worked quite well in terms of, the infrastructure was put in place, the videos were installed, the videos were used. As a side note, I thought this was amazing to see this were actually used even on days when the NGO wasn't around. So the NGO, you could imagine the NGO comes and tells like, hey, are you doing this? And then like, of course, here's my video, I'm using it, right? I have timestamps on every single time when the NGO visited these schools. I can link that to the timestamps from the backend of the software. I know every single time they switched on the projector or the smart TV to show these videos and use them in the classroom. And there's actually teachers use this and like this even when nobody looked over their shoulder, which is great, right? And everybody loved this, right? The ministry loved this. I got some flack in the paper for calling this high quality videos. I'm still standing with this because teachers say that these are high quality videos. They like it, they use it. So this stuff worked, right? In terms of like getting people to use this, right? This is fairly straightforward here in terms of like how we're estimating effects. So you can imagine this is, let's say, test scores on the left-hand side, and then you have these 2 treatment indicators. You have the controls that I mentioned. You have super rich controls. I'm picking those with a lasso, and I also randomized within schools within strata. So I have stratum fixed effects. So there's nothing magic here in terms of the estimation. And again, like the effect on test scores in math is negative for the full intervention. So this is a bit blurred, but it's about a good, 16% of a standard deviation negative impact on the math test scores. Slightly negative of just the workbook intervention. Actually, you cannot distinguish these two from each other. So I think just doing something in the schools might be partially driving that negative effect. But nothing, basically like this reduced how much kids learned in these schools by half. Right? So they learned, as you just saw, they learned something about 20% of a standard deviation. So when you run this, this is the most conservative. Like they're learning we're between 20 to 30% of a standard deviation. At least half of the learning that they usually had in these schools from year to year disappeared, right? Once you introduce this, which is just extremely disruptive. In science, I didn't show you science before because I think science is more problematic in terms of just like how much kids learn, and there's issues with the curriculum, that the curriculum doesn't build on each other. So even like year-on-year growth is something that's very hard to capture. In science, we actually didn't see any growth over year to year because of these problems. But there were also no impacts. So you could say like, well, there was no productivity to begin with, but then there was no negative effects. However you want to interpret this, but basically like we have these negative effects in math and nothing in science. While in math there was learning before, that was slashed by half, and in science there was no learning and there's still no impact, right? So not a great story, but like this is where then the NGO really embraced these findings, and also kudos to USAID, who said like, okay, we're still committed to this and give more funding. Now tweak, now fix, now change, and then we're gonna see, right?
Sorry, Andy, I probably missed it. What the experiment was run in which of the cohorts that you presented earlier in your graph on COVID? You said
pre-COVID.
I'm not sure.
This is the year pre-COVID. So all I'm showing you here is control group. This is control group growth. And then like basically these are 80 schools here. Then I have another 80 schools that
I don't see what you're pointing at.
Oops.
Yeah, okay.
Here.
These cohorts, okay.
This is this cohort, right? Now we found out, hey, there's these negative effects. Then there was some support happening during COVID, but also gave the NGO a breather to reorient themselves and ask themselves, hey, what are we going to do with these findings? And they ended up with saying, okay, let's pull the intervention. And in many ways, I think this is a prime example of, like how you as a researcher can work with an NGO hand in hand over time and just in a partnership and say like, okay, now we're going to do another phase. You learned from this. Let's give some time. We're going to come back. And in a sense, like the COVID disruption gave them 1 year breathing room, or more so actually, to like reorient themselves. What I'm showing you now here in the after school experiment is same schools, but now the treatment in math is actually switched off in terms of what's happening in the classroom. They're not asking them to do anything in the classrooms anymore. And now they're providing a new cohort of kids after school instruction in those schools. Right? I'm very convinced that there is no contamination across cohort for at least 3 reasons. A, COVID happened in between, right? There's this period in between. B, this is a brand new cohort of kids. So it's not like they were previously got some of this video materials, right? And then thirdly, what happened in these schools is that about 3/4 of the government school teachers in these schools got swapped out. So like because of the COVID disruption, they were shut, and then they did some new hiring. So this is okay to do here, right? Sometimes you'd be worried, okay, now you have the same treatment schools are still treatment schools. If you're a reviewer too, here is my answer for you, right? It is fine to do that because this is a new cohort of kids. The other intervention has been completely switched off. And I actually also have data that I can show you as to like whether teachers are still using this video material in the classroom, and they are not, right? But this now is the post-COVID period with this new intervention where they are given after-school instruction. So this looks like this now. So after school, they log on to this remote teaching. Avanti Fellows, the NGO, actually provide these remote classes. And again, in the partial control, they're just getting workbooks that go along with these classes. You see a picture of these workbooks. This is similar to what they received before. So I have 80 schools that receive workbooks and this after-school teaching 5 to 6 times a week, vis-a-vis another group that just receives the workbook. And then there's a full business as usual control group. Kids use this. So what I'm showing you here is, again, I have usage data. How many classes did these kids actually attend over that 2-year period? There's a lot of heterogeneity across that, but kids actually accepted this, right? So over the 2 years, the way you read this is like at the bottom on the X, I'm showing you the number of remote classes attended by everybody in the sample in the treatment ICT school. So this is not conditional or anything. So just like every student that is in my baseline sample, I know how often they attended each of these classes. Right? So the way you read this is like if you go to cumulative probability, it's like if you go to 50, you see like that about 50% of the kids have less than 40 classes attended, but then you have the remaining half of them have more than, let's say, 45 classes attended, right? Or you see like about a good third of the kids have like more than 50 classes attended, right? So this is fairly, certainly, yes, you need to be worried about like this third of the kids who are not attending many classes, right? But like this is, if you think about this, is just an offer as to like after school, will you log in and attend additional schooling, right? this is fairly intense in the sense that kids actually got to attend these classes, right? You'd probably expect something on test scores given that times this level of attendance, right? And as I mentioned before, Mark was like, yes, this probably worked. Yes, it worked in terms of when you compare the ICT group versus the workbook group and the control group in terms of like student attitudes, especially kind of like negative attitudes were reduced. So this is a reversed item, and students now are actually less often agreeing with this. And that's you see positive because it's flipped, but basically where these effects come from are questions around, does math makes me nervous? Do I think math is harder than other subjects and so forth? Again, you cannot tease out the impact across like ICT is not really much better than just giving these workbook intervention, but altogether that package of both in remote instruction and getting the materials has this slight positive effect on student attitudes towards math. Now, potentially, probably more important, however, there's no effects on test scores, right? So no effects on test scores overall, no effects on test scores on higher order thinking skills, lower order thinking skills. And I also map every test question to the level of the test question in terms of, is it low grade level material versus at grade level material that this question is tapping into? And there's no effects on that. So it's a big zero. You can ask yourself, like, is this different for different subgroups of kids? So no, there's a lot of noise across the different districts, and I don't hang my hat on any of this, but I am very interested in, let's say, male versus female, where we also have demographic information on poverty. So these are, different caste categories here. SC, ST are the most vulnerable castes in India, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. That's a big zero among them. We have information on whether they receive what are called ration cards in India. So think about this as a high poverty indicator, and other students who don't have that kind of poverty status in their school, you don't see anything here. And finally, you can do this by baseline test scores. You can see like, you could think that maybe this just works for the highest performing kids, right? We saw these learning losses are happening more seemingly for the higher performing kids. Maybe this helps these kids then help more and protect them from the kind of relative learning losses that I documented before. Is not the case. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the percentile of the residual baseline test score. So like to the very left are the weakest kids, and to the very right are the top performing kids. And then the black line here is the difference between the ICT group versus the control group. So this is non-parametrically, it's just like big flat zero, right? So no effect for any of these kids. Okay. Finally, I told you I have like these super rich student interviews, teacher interviews, and classroom observations. So there's nothing here that pops out in terms of like what's going on here. No effects on the instructional quality that students receive. So you could think that maybe teachers suddenly do something different now that they know that they get some teaching in the afternoon. Slight negative effects on how teachers feel about their locus of control, but it's not statistically significant. So maybe teachers feel like they're not in charge as much anymore in terms of students learning. And then there's these smaller impacts on the amount that teachers assign homework. It actually goes up a little bit. So if anything, that would probably help. You would think that teachers are now assigning a little bit more homework now in the treatment group, maybe because they're knowing that they're getting support in the afternoon, so they're given a little bit more of homework. And there's this other thing that I looked at that in India is very common that students receive what's called private tuition. So most kids in India go to school, then they finish school, and then they go to private school after, or like to a private tutor. Almost all the kids do that. And there's a slight 2 percentage point decrease in the proportion of kids receiving that. So you could think that maybe this after school teaching replaces that. Actually, it didn't replace as much. So it's really layering on top of schooling, tutoring, and then extra actually these classes, right? On top of the usual tutoring that the students receive. There's not a lot of substitution happening. If anything, it's like 2 percentage point difference in terms of the percentage of kids who receive that kind of after school, what in India is called tuition. Right? Okay. All right, we made it. Again, like, thanks for sticking with me. 3 takeaways here. Like, sustained disruption, student learning in the 2-year period after schools reopened, massive. If anything, there's a complete standstill, no absolute learning gains happening anymore. Even more so than during the pandemic for one of the grades, as you pointed out. Negative effects pre-pandemic on asking teachers to blend their instruction with these video materials in the classroom. And then post-pandemic, some positive effect on student attitudes toward math, but no effects on math test scores once we provided these after-school remote classes. All right, I stop here. I think we have a few minutes left for open questions, but thanks a lot again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Andy. Do we have questions?
You can ask in French too. I mean, I try to understand, so I might answer in English, but any questions are welcome.
So, to me, what's not super clear at this point is, so what is this adjustment cost story exactly, right? Do you have any data, something to interpret this negative effect?
Yes, in the pre-pandemic period, right? So
yeah, the second one, yes, the negative on math of this.
Yeah, I jumped over this a little bit, but so I do have information on, let's say, the instructional quality that teachers provide. So these are classroom observations. Very good information on that. I see a massive negative effect on the quality of instruction that students received in that year after they were asked to blend their teaching with these technology, with the videos in their classroom. These ratings actually come from the NGO themselves that they conducted during their visits. So if anything, they're positively biased, right? Like I then video recorded some of these, re-rated them, and then with neutral observers in an office, and compare that and got a sense of how much bias is in there, and then remove that bias. What you see here to the left is the NGO provided ratings, and to the right is the adjusted video-based re-ratings. That's a full standard deviation of a negative effect that you see here of the ICT intervention. So massive, massive negative effects in terms of the quality of instruction that students receive.
But this quality refers to anything that they did in the class, or activities related to the intervention, to the videos, etc.
Anything in the class. So this is comparing treatment and control. You sit in the back of the classroom, and I developed a standardized classroom observation rubric, and they very similar. I was in very close touch with the Teach team at the bank. This is right before the Teach was released. So, but I modeled this after the Teach and other instruments that capture the quality of instruction that students receive during set times snapshots and during set periods, right? So then they were prompted to look at specific indicators of instruction and rate those during these periods, and then I created an index out of this. So imagine you sit in the back of the class, you were trained on these indicators, and then you're given a rating on the quality of, let's say, the clarity of instruction and the lack of errors, right, in that dimension, right? You rate this, and then that's what I use to construct this index.
So does it look like they are relying on the video, and then they're not really intervening in the class or something like this? Is that what it means?
I wouldn't say so, because these videos are just 2 or 3 minutes long, so they're really designed so that you can co-teach with them, right? This is not like often these are misinterpreted as oh, the teacher is just switching on the video. This is not it, right? You have to teach something and then use us to teach along with it, and they're designed like that to blend your instruction and improve your instruction. But to the extent that this was the plan, actually it drastically reduced the quality of instruction that students received in these classrooms.
All right.
I have a question regarding a result, but not from the RCTs, but from the first part of your talk on the relative losses. Yeah, this on this table. It seems that you said that the losses was stronger for the higher achieving students, right? That seems counterintuitive, no? And I think in most of the analysis that I've seen on this, on the COVID losses, it seemed that the highest, at least from a more socioeconomic background, the students from lower SES had higher losses.
Mhm.
So I would expect that the learning levels would be. I would have expected the opposite here, but
Yeah, me too. So
okay. So was it a result like in India in general that was maybe different from other parts of the world where I've seen the opposite, or?
So no. So this narrative that you just mentioned, that like kids of like lower socioeconomic status were hit worse by the pandemic, is the same narrative that you have, for example, when you look at learning loss analysis by the Asser and Pratham, right, in India. So that narrative is there, right? Certainly, I can just present what the data that I have and give the data to you. So, but you're absolutely right. It contradicts what you see. This also contradicts like a lot, right? And there's no explanation for this that's very clear to me, like why it would be like that. I'm just showing you, like, I think everything I can learn from this data. I think what's really neat here is that, like, I'm sharing with you something that is not under the pressure of just publication bias also, not to suggest that too much, but imagine you have a paper where you don't see any learning losses, right? I don't think that's going to have a good chance of getting published, right? So not to suggest that like the SAS is affected by that as much, right? But I sometimes wonder, like, how much publication bias is there in the learning loss piece, right? So I certainly haven't seen anybody who would just show information like this. But you're absolutely right. For me, this is surprising. This is surprising as well. The no difference by gender is also surprising, right? Like that actually that the girls and boys lost the same. Certainly when you look at, let's say, the UNESCO reports, also the global monitoring report that's highly critical of educational technology and the use of technology during the pandemic, they said like, oh, boys were like doing much better during the pandemic versus girls because they were like receiving additional support versus girls who did not. I can just show you the data, and at least in this case, I don't see any differences here.
Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask a quick question, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, come down. Hey,
hi, Andy. Sorry, I don't have a camera, so well, anyway, sorry. But it's a really short one. I'm wondering if the NGOs or the teachers are still implementing the programs right now, if you are looking for a follow-up, and if you believe that it can be a U-shaped impact over time that actually could take more time to the teachers to get really good with it, and do you believe in it, or?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Like, so like, see to Mark's point, right? Like, if this is an adjustment cost, right? And most folks who this actually comes from like this paradox that we know about, and touches on this. Like, you introduce a technology, and at the beginning you actually don't see any positive effects. Right? And that's a productivity paradox that you see that you saw when computers came first around. You even see now it again, like, with AI, and like, there's just no impacts on productivity. And then one of the arguments is like, well, it's just going to take time, and people are going to adjust. They have to pay for some adjustment costs, but then it's going to all go up in the end, right? Unfortunately, I cannot see what the effect would have been in the second year, right? Because the pandemic came around. We did try to actually continue to run the intervention in science in the year post-COVID, and we don't see any effects there. So it's different from like this adjustment cost and then whether this adjustment pays off. So if you ask me, do I think, or does the NGO still think that the in-classroom blended instruction intervention is going to do much? It's a clear no. And they are also now, I think, ready to completely pivot. They already pivoted in math. They gave it another round in another 2-year cohort in science. I think they're very much ready to move on.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. I think we have to stop here. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much for waking up, probably. And I see you tomorrow, I guess, Andy, otherwise. But
yeah.
thank you, everyone, for attending this seminar. And see you soon. I think we have a seminar in May with Alexandre, if I'm not wrong. So see you then, Alexandre To, who is here with us. Okay, see you.